July 22nd, 1461. The summer heat pressed down on the Château de Mehun-sur-Yèvre as King Charles VII of France lay dying, consumed by fever, paranoia, and the crushing weight of betrayal. This was not the dignified end befitting a victorious monarch who had expelled the English from French soil and unified a fractured kingdom. Instead, Charles VII's final hours were marked by physical agony, mental torment, and the devastating knowledge that his own son eagerly awaited his death from the safety of enemy territory. Picture this scene, if you will. The once mighty king who had risen from the depths of national humiliation to become Charles the Victorious now lay helpless, his body racked with pain, his mind consumed by delusions of treachery. For over 2 years, a festering infection had ravaged his body, but it was the final week that would prove most horrific. An abscess in his jaw had swollen to such proportions that he could neither eat nor drink, leaving him to slowly starve as his strength ebbed away. But physical suffering was only half the torment. The king's paranoid ravings echoed through the castle halls as he ranted about traitors and conspirators, his fevered mind convinced that enemies surrounded him at every turn. Most devastating of all was the conspicuous absence of his eldest son Louis, the Dauphin, who had not only refused his father's dying wish to see him one last time, but had actually consulted astrologers to predict the exact hour of the king's death. To understand the profound darkness of these final moments, we must first grasp the extraordinary journey that brought Charles VII to this tragic end. Born in 1403 as the 11th child of the mad King Charles VI, young Charles had never been expected to rule. His father's infamous bouts of insanity, including the bizarre delusion that his body was made of glass, cast a long shadow over the royal family. When Charles VI disinherited his own son in 1420, recognizing Henry V of England as the legitimate heir to France, it seemed the Valois dynasty was finished. The young Charles was mockingly called the King of Bourges, controlling only a small territory in central France while the English occupied Paris and most of the northern kingdom. His legitimacy questioned, his resources limited, his future appeared hopeless. Yet from this desperate position, Charles VII would orchestrate one of history's most remarkable comebacks, transforming himself from a ridiculed pretender into the king who would drive the English from French soil forever. The turning point came with a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, whose divine visions and unwavering faith breathed new life into the French resistance. Joan's influence culminated in Charles's coronation at Reims Cathedral in 1429, finally legitimizing his claim to the throne. But even this triumph carried the seeds of future darkness. When Joan was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, Charles made no serious effort to save her, allowing political expediency to override loyalty to the woman who had restored his crown. This calculated abandonment of Joan revealed a cold pragmatism that would characterize much of Charles's reign. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 saw him formally condemn the murder of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, a deeply humiliating act since the murder had occurred in Charles's own presence years earlier. Yet this strategic concession broke the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, allowing Charles to recapture Paris and systematically drive the English from France. By the end of the Hundred Years' War, Charles VII had transformed from a desperate pretender into Charles the Victorious, master of a unified French kingdom. But victory came at a personal cost that would haunt his later years. The constant warfare, political betrayals, and necessary compromises had hardened the king, leaving him increasingly suspicious and isolated. His relationship with his eldest son Louis grew increasingly strained as the Dauphin chafed under his father's authority and openly displayed his impatience for the throne. In 1446, Charles banished Louis to the Dauphiné, and father and son would never meet again. The final decade of Charles's reign was marked by declining health and escalating paranoia. Around 1458, he developed a persistent sore on his leg that refused to heal, likely indicating an underlying condition such as diabetes. This chronic ailment led to a serious fever that would plague him for over 2 years, steadily weakening his body while his mind grappled with growing anxieties about his legacy and his fractured family. The king's paranoia was not entirely unfounded. His son Louis had indeed been cultivating his own power base, forming alliances with foreign princes and openly defying royal authority. In 1456, Louis fled to the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, seeking protection from his own father. This act of outright rebellion was a public humiliation for Charles, confirming his worst fears about his son's disloyalty, while providing ammunition for his growing delusions about conspiracies and betrayal. As his physical condition deteriorated, Charles's mental state became increasingly unstable, reminiscent of his father's madness but manifesting differently. Where Charles VI had suffered from bizarre delusions about his physical form, Charles VII was consumed by paranoid fantasies about political treachery. He became convinced that his court was filled with traitors loyal to Louis, and his ravings about conspiracies grew more frequent and intense as his strength faded. The final week of July 1461 brought unimaginable physical torment. The infection that had started in his leg had spread to his jaw, creating a massive abscess that swelled his mouth shut. Unable to swallow food or water, the king began to starve, his body consuming itself as his mind descended further into delirium. The irony was cruel beyond measure. Charles VII, who had fought so hard to reclaim his kingdom and had succeeded beyond all expectations, was now powerless to perform the most basic act of sustaining his own life. Historical accounts describe the king's unwillingness to die, despite his prolonged suffering, suggesting a powerful will to live that battled against his failing body. This tenacity, which had served him well throughout his difficult reign, now only prolonged his agony. Perhaps he clung to a desperate hope for reconciliation with Louis, or maybe his paranoid mind convinced him that death would only confirm his enemy's victory. Whatever the reason, Charles VII fought death with the same stubborn determination he had once used to fight the English. But Louis remained coldly absent, consulting his astrologers and making preparations for his succession while his father lay dying. The Dauphin's calculated indifference was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Even as courtiers begged Louis to visit his dying father, he refused, choosing instead to wait at Aven in Burgundy for news of the king's death. This final act of defiance and disrespect must have been devastating to Charles, confirming his worst fears about his son's character and his own failure as a father. The contrast between Charles's public triumph and private tragedy was stark and heartbreaking. The king who had unified France and ended the 100 Years' War was dying alone, abandoned by his heir, consumed by physical pain and mental anguish. His younger son Charles, Duke of Berry, remained by his side, providing some small comfort, but this loyal presence could not erase the devastating wound inflicted by Louis's absence. The location of his death, the Château de Mehun-sur-Yèvre, became a symbol of his isolation from the grand courts of Paris and the political center of his kingdom. This castle, away from the bustling life of the capital, witnessed the private suffering of a public figure whose personal end stood in tragic contrast to his professional achievements. The very walls that should have provided comfort and security instead echoed with the king's delirious ravings about betrayal and conspiracy. As July 22nd dawned, the 58-year-old king's strength finally began to fail completely. The infection, the starvation, and the psychological torment had taken their toll. Charles VII, who had reigned for 38 years and 8 months, who had risen from the depths of national humiliation to become one of France's most successful monarchs, was finally succumbing to forces he could not defeat through willpower or political cunning. The irony of his situation was profound and tragic. The man who had spent his entire reign fighting external enemies and internal rebellions was ultimately defeated by his own body and his own family. The king, who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics, could not bridge the chasm that had opened between himself and his eldest son. The monarch who had united a fractured kingdom could not heal the divisions within his own household. Charles VII's final hours were thus a study in contrasts between public achievement and private failure, between the triumph of his reign and the tragedy of his death. The darkness that enveloped his last moments was not merely physical, though the pain of starvation and infection was certainly real and terrible. It was also psychological and emotional, rooted in the devastating knowledge that his life's work might be undone by the very son who should have been his greatest ally and supporter. The king's paranoid delusions in his final days, while certainly influenced by his physical condition and possible hereditary predisposition to mental instability, were also grounded in painful reality. Louis truly was disloyal, truly was eager for his father's death, truly was already making plans to rule. The tragedy was not that Charles was imagining betrayal where none existed, but that the betrayal was all too real, and came from the person whose love and loyalty should have been unquestioned. As the summer day wore on and the king's breathing became more labored, those present at his deathbed witnessed the end of an era. Charles VII had been the last king of the medieval period in many ways, ruling through personal relationships and feudal loyalties rather than the more centralized bureaucratic systems that would characterize later French monarchy. The infection that had begun as a simple sore on Charles's leg had now spread with terrifying efficiency. By the final week of July 1461, the abscess had migrated to his jaw, creating a grotesque swelling that would seal his fate in the most horrific way imaginable. The tumor grew so large that it completely blocked his throat, making it impossible for the king to swallow even the smallest drop of water or morsel of food. Imagine the terror of being fully conscious, desperately thirsty and hungry, yet physically unable to consume anything. Charles VII, who had once commanded armies and ruled a kingdom, was now reduced to a state of helpless starvation while his own body betrayed him. The courtiers who remained by his bedside watched in horror as their once mighty king slowly withered away, his body consuming itself for sustenance while his mind descended further into delirium. The physical agony was matched only by his psychological torment. In his fevered state, Charles became convinced that everyone around him was a spy for Louis, waiting to report his every weakness to his treacherous son. He would rant incoherently about betrayal, his voice growing weaker with each passing hour as dehydration took its toll. The paranoia that had been building for years now reached its crescendo, transforming his final days into a waking nightmare of suspicion and fear. What made this suffering even more unbearable was the knowledge that Louis was actively using astrologers to predict the exact moment of his death. While Charles lay dying, unable to eat or drink, his heir was consulting fortune-tellers and star readers, treating his father's demise like a scheduled appointment. The cold calculation of it all must have been devastating to whatever remained of the king's paternal feelings. The younger Charles, Duke of Berry, remained dutifully at his father's bedside, providing what little comfort he could. But even this loyal son's presence couldn't fill the gaping wound left by Louis's absence. The king would sometimes call out for his eldest son in his delirium, only to be reminded again and again that Louis would not come, that he was waiting safely in Burgundy for news of the royal death. The courtiers who witnessed these final days described a scene of almost biblical suffering. The king's body, once robust enough to lead military campaigns, had become a skeletal frame draped in royal robes. His face, gaunt from starvation, bore the hollow-eyed look of a man being consumed from within. The abscess in his jaw had distorted his features, making speech increasingly difficult and painful. As the days dragged on without food or water, Charles's delirium intensified. He would sometimes believe he was back on the battlefield, calling out orders to phantom soldiers. Other times, he would weep inconsolably, mourning not just his approaching death, but the son who had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. The psychological wounds inflicted by Louis's betrayal seemed to hurt him more than the physical agony of starvation. The medical knowledge of the time was utterly inadequate to address such a severe infection. The royal physicians could only stand by helplessly as their patient deteriorated before their eyes. They tried various remedies, bleeding him according to the medical wisdom of the era, applying poultices to the external swelling, but nothing could reduce the internal abscess that was slowly killing him. Their efforts only added to his suffering, weakening an already failing body. What makes Charles's final ordeal particularly tragic is that it lasted for over a week. This wasn't a quick, merciful death, but a prolonged agony that gave him ample time to contemplate his failures and betrayals. Hour after hour, day after day, he lay there unable to eat or drink, his body slowly shutting down while his mind remained cruelly alert to his suffering. The irony wasn't lost on those present that the king who had survived so many assassination attempts and battlefield dangers was being killed by his own body. The leg that had carried him to victory was now the source of the infection that would destroy him. The mouth that had issued royal commands could no longer perform the basic function of swallowing. It was as if his own flesh had turned traitor, joining the ranks of those who had betrayed him. The political implications of his prolonged death agony were enormous. With the king clearly dying but clinging to life, the kingdom existed in a state of suspended animation. Important decisions were delayed, courtiers positioned themselves for the coming regime change, and foreign powers watched nervously to see how the succession would unfold. Yet through it all, Louis remained conspicuously absent, more concerned with his own preparations for kingship than with his father's suffering. The stench of the infected abscess filled the royal chambers, making it difficult for attendants to remain close to the king for extended periods. This physical revulsion added another layer of isolation to Charles's final days, as even those who wished to comfort him found it challenging to endure the smell of his rotting flesh. The king, who had once been surrounded by fawning courtiers, now found himself alone with his agony. Religious figures were summoned to provide last rites and spiritual comfort, but even they struggled to penetrate the fog of Charles's delirium and paranoia. When priests attempted to hear his final confession, he would sometimes accuse them of being Louis's agents, sent to extract state secrets or manipulate his will. The spiritual solace that might have eased his passage into death was denied to him by his own fractured mind. The temperature in the Château de Mehun-sur-Yèvre during that blazing July only added to the horror. The summer heat intensified the smell of infection and made the king's fever even more unbearable. Windows had to be kept closed to maintain some semblance of privacy and dignity, turning the royal chambers into a sweltering prison where death came calling with agonizing slowness. As July 22nd dawned, it became clear that Charles VII could endure no more. His body, deprived of sustenance for over a week, had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. The infection had spread throughout his system, and his vital organs were beginning to fail. Yet even in these final hours, witnesses reported that he continued to mumble Louis's name, as if hoping against hope that his son might still appear at his bedside. The actual moment of death, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic after such prolonged suffering. There was no dramatic final speech, no noble last words for the history books. Charles VII simply stopped breathing, his tortured body finally surrendering to the inevitable. The great king who had saved France from English domination died alone in his agony, abandoned by the son he had raised to succeed him. The immediate aftermath was swift and telling. Messengers were dispatched to inform Louis of his father's death, but there was no period of mourning, no respectful pause before the machinery of succession began to turn. Louis, who had been waiting for this news like a merchant anticipating a profitable transaction, immediately began his journey to claim the throne. There would be time for grief later, if at all. The servants who had tended to Charles in his final days were left to prepare the royal corpse, washing away the evidence of his suffering and dressing him in the ceremonial robes of kingship. They worked to restore some dignity to the man who had endured such an undignified death, but nothing could erase the memory of those terrible final weeks from their minds. The official announcements of the king's death spoke of his great victories and lasting contributions to France, but they could never capture the full tragedy of his final hours. History would remember Charles VII as the victorious and the well-served, but those who witnessed his death knew a darker truth about the price of kingship and the cruelty of fate. In the end, Charles VII's dark last hours serve as a powerful reminder that even the mightiest rulers are subject to the frailties of human flesh and the betrayals of human nature. As Charles VII's condition deteriorated beyond all hope, the final week of his life became an unbearable nightmare of physical agony and mental torment. The infection that had ravaged his body for over 2 years reached its most cruel crescendo. The abscess in his jaw had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his mouth became completely sealed shut, transforming the simple act of swallowing into an impossibility. For days, the once mighty King of France lay dying, unable to consume even the smallest drop of water or morsel of bread. Witnesses to these final hours described scenes that would haunt them forever. The king's chamber at Château de Mehun-sur-Yèvre had become a place of horror. The stench of infection permeated the air, mixing with the oppressive July heat to create an atmosphere of decay and despair. Charles VII's body, once the vessel of royal authority, had withered to a skeletal frame. His skin, yellowed and drawn tight across his bones, bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged starvation and disease. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the sound emanating from the dying monarch. Between labored breaths, Charles VII would suddenly erupt into fits of delirious ranting, his voice hoarse and broken. He spoke of conspiracies that existed only in his fevered mind, calling out accusations against courtiers who he believed were plotting his downfall. In his delirium, he would sometimes cry out for Louis, his absent son, alternating between desperate pleas for reconciliation and bitter curses condemning the Dauphin's betrayal. The few loyal attendants who remained by his bedside watched helplessly as their king's mind fractured under the weight of his suffering. Some reported that in his lucid moments, Charles VII would weep uncontrollably, not from physical pain but from the crushing realization that his eldest son had abandoned him completely. The man who had conquered the English and restored French glory was reduced to a broken father, dying alone and unloved by his heir. During these tortuous final days, news arrived that only deepened the king's anguish. Reports reached the castle that Louis was not merely waiting for word of his father's death, but was actively consulting with astrologers and fortune-tellers, seeking to pinpoint the exact hour when he would inherit the crown. The cold calculation of this act struck Charles VII like a physical blow. His son was not grieving or praying for his recovery, but was instead treating his father's death as nothing more than a scheduled appointment with destiny. The contrast between his two sons became painfully apparent in these final hours. While Louis remained in distant Burgundy, consulting his mystics and preparing for his coronation, Charles, Duke of Berry, never left his father's side. The younger son held vigil through the long, agonizing nights, moistening his father's cracked lips with dampened cloth and offering what little comfort he could. Yet even this filial devotion could not heal the gaping wound left by Louis's absence. As July 22nd dawned, it became clear that the end was near. Charles VII's breathing had become increasingly labored, each breath a monumental effort that racked his emaciated frame. The infection had spread throughout his body, and the prolonged starvation had sapped what little strength remained. His eyes, once sharp with the intelligence that had outwitted the English, now stared vacantly at the ceiling, occasionally focusing with moments of terrible clarity before drifting back into delirium. In his final conscious moments, Charles VII reportedly whispered a prayer, not for his own salvation, but for France itself. He feared that his death would bring civil war, that Louis's ruthless ambition would tear apart the kingdom he had spent his life rebuilding. The irony was not lost on him that the son who refused to comfort his dying father would soon inherit the very crown that Charles had fought so desperately to preserve and strengthen. The actual moment of death came quietly, almost anticlimactically, for a king whose life had been filled with such drama and triumph. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of his chamber, Charles VII simply stopped breathing. There was no final dramatic speech, no last words of wisdom or forgiveness. The king, who had defied the English, survived civil war, and restored French honor died as he had lived his final years in pain, isolation, and profound disappointment in the son who should have been his greatest achievement. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the full extent of his tragic end. While Charles, Duke of Berry, wept over his father's lifeless form, arranging for the proper ceremonies and mourning rituals, Louis was already in motion. The Dauphin had positioned himself strategically, and within hours of receiving confirmation of his father's death, he was racing toward Reims for his coronation. There would be no period of mourning, no reflection on his father's legacy or regret for their broken relationship. The body of Charles VII, once the symbol of French resurgence, was prepared for burial with the dignity befitting a king, yet the ceremony felt hollow. The man who had transformed France from a divided, occupied territory into a unified kingdom was laid to rest beside his parents in Saint-Denis, as he had requested. But the bitter irony remained that his greatest victory, the survival and strengthening of the French monarchy, had come at the cost of his relationship with the very son who would inherit its benefits. The dark last hours of King Charles VII serve as a haunting reminder that even the most successful rulers are not immune to personal tragedy. His death was not the peaceful passing of a satisfied monarch surrounded by loving family, but rather the agonizing end of a man tormented by physical pain, mental anguish, and the crushing weight of filial betrayal. The king, who had conquered external enemies, ultimately fell victim to the internal demons of disease, paranoia, and a broken heart. In the end, Charles VII's legacy would be defined by his public triumphs, the expulsion of the English, the unification of France, and the restoration of royal authority. But his final hours tell a different story, one of human frailty and the terrible price sometimes paid for greatness. The darkness that consumed his last days stands as a somber counterpoint to his glorious reign, a reminder that behind every crown lies a mortal man, vulnerable to the same sufferings that afflict all humanity.